Next up, we have Zihan Song and Rob Roth, visual storytelling with maps, update and outlook from an empirical study.
Does this have a playback? No. That's pretty much.
Right here. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Redlands. It's so good to see you here, and also hello to the folks online. My name is Zihan Song. I am a senior product engineer working on ArcGIS Pro team here at Esri. And today here I'm with Rob, who was my advisor when I was in grad school.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Rob Roth. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin, and I'm really excited to present a paper that's hot off the presses. Was just released on cartographic perspectives on the topic of visual storytelling with maps. And there are some intersections with the theme of this session, particularly as we'll try to point out around empathy. Okay, so the last time I was here, I was invited to present on the topic of visual storytelling, something that I hadn't been researching at the time, but I had just developed an advanced level class around storytelling, trying to bring in a variety of ideas from literature, linguistics, digital humanities to support a visual culture certificate on our campus. And so I was asked to kind of present the backbone, the skeleton of that course. And I came with three big ideas. So for some background that's going to frame our project, the first big idea was thinking about narrative as structure. And going all the way back to Aristotle's Poetics, where a narrative has a story, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And as it's been dramatized in cinema and film and creative writing, there's often beginning with a setup act. Here we introduce the setting, present key characters. For maps, characters can be places, they don't have to necessarily be people. Provide problem context and often try to have some captivating early scene, a hook. We then move into the conflict, which is the main problem or catalyst that's driving this rising action in the visual story. As we build sort of this drama, we try to present the tension between the characters, between a character and an external force. We finally get to the climactic scene where the characters have to face the main problem and then offer some sort of resolution. And maybe there's a denouement where we're wrapping up loose ends, or perhaps a cliffhanger where we're encouraging the audience to kind of enter the story and choose their own adventure. So we absolutely break from a linear narrative all the time, particularly in film. But this idea as kind of a foundational grounding of how cartographers can think about narrative as structure, narrative as something we can design. A second big idea I presented was on the concept of genres in visual storytelling. I have to give a shout out for the book we recently released in collaboration with the United Nations and the International Cartographic Association. This was the two-page spread on storytelling. We're really focusing on these genres as ways to essentially put linear storytelling into an otherwise non-linear or two-dimensional map. And so before sort of digital and web environments, static stories would use annotation and numbering in order to try to guide the eye linearly around the map page. But today we can use the browser scroll, calling that infographics. We can advance through slides, so what we're doing here in our PowerPoint. We can play a recorded video. We can use hyperlink in a multimedia experience to activate content. Users themselves can contribute information to kind of structure the linearity, and we can have stories being released as events unfold. These are all ways to add linearity, but different interactive techniques to enforce linearity in a visual story, and again, in an otherwise non-linear two-dimensional map. The final big idea that I presented when I was here was the concept of tropes. And so these are design techniques that are used not to encode spatial information, so not to represent, not as symbols or maps, but instead to help advance and enhance our linear narrative. And in the paper that is referenced here, I talk about all sorts of tropes that relate a lot to what we were just speaking about earlier, maybe setting the mood, so getting people into the right emotional standpoint, bringing in alternative voices and multiple voices, so kind of having a conversation within the map, using visual metaphors as a way that's more intuitive or grokable to approach complex concepts. We're going to focus today onto attention And so different design techniques that are used to, again, as you're reading this linear story, to highlight, emphasize, accent key information that you can't miss in the overall story arc. And so various different design techniques that maybe we could apply to data, but now we're using them essentially to enhance our narrative. Take it away, Zihan.
Thanks. So I was in Rob's class when Rob started his talk, and most of the parts were untested. So that's kind of reason why I choose this as my research area. And then also we would like to know more about this area. So we have 4 research questions in total. Basically, we would like to know which part of the story, in fact, is effectiveness. So we designed our story using this 3-act narrative structure to see if it's effective. And for others, we test 2 common genres. One is long-form infographics, and the other is dynamic slideshows. And we have 2 tropes. Both are focus attention. One is color highlighting, and the other is leader lines. And last one, we would like to know what's the influence of individual difference on this topic. So as an international student, when I first came to US, I found myself react really differently with others, even when listening to the same story. Although, except for Rob's joke, his jokes are great, understandable.
Cross-cultural.
But the truth is, the individual difference is rarely considered as part of the mapping research. They're more part of the sample. So in that case, individual difference here we add as part of research question, so we can bring more empathy in cutoff work. So this is the table from our paper in here. We have 2 story themes in total. One is presidential campaign donation, which is about story how donation impact election vote on the swing state. And the other story is about sea level rising, which is about how sea level rising impact the vulnerable properties on the coastal state. So on this table can help us to track what content and how much content we would like to put in the story in each of the act. So they are more comparable and are quantitatively the same. So each story has 9 panels in total. Each panel represents a unique narrative element. So for example, panel 1 is the hook and panel 7 is the climax. This table is a great template for us when we plan our story design in this study. So here is an example of how our genres look like on this online study platform. So for the one on the left is a long-form infographics, which all the contents are in this linear vertical way that audience can scroll to view the content at their own pace. And for the one on the right is dynamic slideshows, which we show one panel at a time, and the audience have to click the next and previous button to reload every time when they want to review some new content. And here are the 2 examples that we applied the 2 tropes on the same panel. So in our sea level rising story, we try to focus our audience attention on the 2 geographic characters, which are New York and North Carolina, which were like the protagonist and antagonist in our story. So for the one on the left, we apply this black outline around the states, which is our color highlighting trop strategy. And for the one on the right, we use this black line to point to the states directly, which is our leader line trop strategy. So we have this 2x2x2 factorial design. We have 2 story themes in total, sea level rising and presidential campaign donations. We have 2 genres, long form infographics and dynamic slideshows. And we have 2 tropes, leader line and color highlighting. So we have 8 unique combinations of story in total. For the one on the right is kind of like it goes through overview example of how our story look like. So for 2, we can see that we try to apply the same style across the stories. Like we use the same color hue within each single story, and we try to apply the same style, same design. Because we only want to focus on these factors, so we have the experiment control to control the rest to stay the same. And we have 125 participants in total. Each of them view 2 of the stories. After the participants review their stories, we ask them questions about retention, comprehension, and reaction. For the retention questions, which are the classic map reading tasks, And for the comprehension question, they're open-ended and more qualitative. Then we coded the participants' answer to see whether their answer capture will mention any of the key parts of our narrative elements. And for the reaction, those are the reaction questions are in this Likert scale format, which is a great way to measure the audience emotional response and their core affects, like how they feel or how they like about the story they just see. And we also collect information about individual differences, include motivation, expertise, and priority beliefs. So these are the information that we in this Likert scale format and are also used in our result process steps. So speaking of result, I will switch about our result.
All right, so this is one of the factorial ANOVA models for retention. I just kind of want to explain what you're looking at because it might be hard to see the numbers. So we have three different kinds of tasks in increased difficulty, and then a total retention. Those are the columns. The top half are descriptive stats. So we have the overall, and then factor one, the theme, factor two, the genre, factor three, the trope. And really the key thing are the factorial ANOVA results, which are shaded according to the significance. And so if there was a significant difference by, say, theme, it would be a particular color. So first, looking at retention, we observed a predictable increase in difficulty, so decrease in retention as the task increased. And this is something that's aligned with current scholarship on taxonomies. And in some ways, it's a good thing because even though the maps were within this linear story, this three-act narrative, they're still behaving essentially as maps. A second positive about the three-act narrative is that the theme itself actually didn't have a difference on retention, a significant difference on retention. And so it was instead the design of the visual stories that had the significant differences on retention. And so for genre, participants performed better when they were presented the same content in long-form infographics. And so using the self-paced browser scroll. And to a weaker degree for tropes, it was leader lines that resulted in greater recall, better recall over the color highlighting. And so for at least retention, which again is the classic kind of map reading tasks that we started with, the genre and trope does matter, meaning that cartographers can make decisions that may be better or worse in the overall design. So this is a two-page table that is showing comprehension. And we took these open-ended qualitative responses and coded them according to these narrative elements. So we have sort of the protagonist, antagonist, problem, tension, and so on. And then also looked at a total retention and then any mistakes that actually, things that were mentioned that weren't in the story themselves that were brought from outside. And so the first thing that we found was that the discussion in this open-ended feedback from Mechanical Turk was actually pretty rich. We weren't expecting as long or as robust descriptions of the story. And so almost 50% of the overall narrative elements were mentioned, which I think is a good thing from the structure and the highlighting that we use. Second, there was no significant difference in the overall comprehension by theme, but there in total, but there were more mistakes in the presidential campaign donations. And we ran the study after the controversial 2016 presidential election. And there was a lot of problematic misconceptions that were put in there that we ultimately coded as mistakes. Third, to look at the genre, nearly all the participants that viewed the long form infographic noted the problem, which is kind of the main point of the entire map. But there was a small but significant number with dynamic slideshows that missed the problem altogether. And so this kind of clickbait where you're sort of having to progress through slides ultimately led a small group to just sort of miss the whole point of the story. And finally, one unexpected finding that we had was that there were no significant differences in comprehension by genre or trope. We weren't expecting that. But digging deeper, I think this relates to just the difficulty of this sort of more qualitative measure of comprehension that all sort of standardized testing has. And in the paper, we talk about alternative social science methods that we might be able to use. So finally, reaction. This gets at sort of the emotional impact. So thinking about trying to build empathy. The theme here was the strongest driver of reaction. So in particular, negative reactions. There was a much stronger reaction to that this story was concerning, and also a much stronger reaction that this story was upsetting to the presidential campaign donations story. I'll talk more about that in a second, but unfortunately, this confirms a lot of climate change communication science, that it's much more difficult to get people to care about an issue like sea level rise that doesn't have a boundary and also has a much longer time frame. So there's just generally a neutral response. One interesting thing is that there was a significant difference in upsetting this by dynamic slideshows. And so we often want a positive emotional experience, but sometimes the topic is upsetting, and we should have a congruently upsetting response. So even though we might not always want to be using dynamic slideshows, there might be a purpose for them if there's an emotional congruence. And finally, as a quick note, the leader lines also activated, so there was greater interest, which is really the point of attention. Okay, finally, and then we'll move to our conclusions, Yuhao. This is the results of an ordinal linear regression model, and there is a lot to unpack here. I'm going to give you just three broad sort of take-homes, and then refer you to the paper. But first, when it comes to retention, it's really your interest and familiarity in digital technology that's driving improved retention. And one interesting finding was that if you preferred print news, you're much less likely to retain information from these visual stories. So kind of a generational digital divide still exists. Secondly, we found with the US sea level rise that if you had stronger beliefs about climate change being a problem or even experience around these topics, you actually had less comprehension. And this, again, gets to some of the complexity of what comprehension means. But here you might be bringing that experience into the story, and that might be hard-won sort of expertise, right? So possibly a good thing. Finally, and probably most importantly for the theme of this session, individual differences had a huge impact on our emotional reactions, our participant emotional reactions. The more politically aligned or the more you believed in the story, the more likely you're to have a strong emotional balance. So either you were more excited, more interested, but also more upset, more concerned. When we think about empathy, we're trying to create these visual stories to have people who maybe are unaware or don't care begin to care about these issues, right? What we're also observed was that people that already care were actually kind of reinforcing potentially some trauma and sort of the doom scrollness of constantly being seen in these media. And so we don't have a necessarily designed solution for that issue, but it's something we need, I think, to study further. And Zihan, take us home.
Well, yes, thanks, Rob, for this detailed and great result. So here are our taking points. The first, when you design story, consider using three-act narrative elements. This three-act narrative structure is really effective when structure your visual stories. And second, use long-form infographics. Long-form infographics really outperform slideshow, especially in retention and comprehension. So next time when you do your slideshow, when you do your presentation, consider using Esri star maps instead of PPT slides. And the third, use the leader line for focus attention. It's especially helpful in the retention, and also important to enforce the linearity in an otherwise non-linear story. And last, story themes and individual difference do impact users' reaction. How can we design effective stories without knowing about our audience? So please take care of our audience, and future research is needed on the individual differences. And of course, in this year, Esri did some awesome work on the map-based visual storytelling as well. Here's some of my favorite features, like the express map, and also you can set up the scenes to set up the tone of your story. And the one on the right is from the storymaps.com, which the slogan is my favorite. Esri has everyone has a story to tell, and Esri really believe this and make this process really easy for you. So thank you. That's all for today's talk.
I think we have time for maybe one question.
So the finding of people who have experienced stuff and then it was like harder for them to comprehend. That's like really interesting, and it reminds me of when people are learning all the technical aspects of a language, and including phonetics, and it can be harder. Like if you grew up speaking English, it can be harder for someone to learn English language the same way that someone who's not an English language speaker learns it elsewhere. Or I don't know, I grew up hearing Spanish and it was really hard for me in Spanish class to understand. And then I discovered that's actually really normal. So I wonder if something about that cognition and comprehensive that happens with language and relationship is similar to what's happening there. And I wonder if that'd be worth looking into. Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I think Michu Meng's lecture this morning hit on some potential issues around confirmation bias. And I think at one level, you kind of see what you expect to see. And I think that might have happened with folks that thought they knew the whole story, right? But there's also kind of that unlearning that might have to happen when you're presented with potentially troublesome information. One thing we did have time to talk about was that one story had a liberal leaning and one story had a conservative leaning. And so seeing how that kind of maybe moved the needle on one side or the other, you kind of come into it expecting a certain story, and then especially in an academic study, and then having that sort of slight bias, also you might have missed that because you just didn't, weren't prepared to see it. But certainly it's a finding that is more curious than just like we're expecting it one way. I think it's be interesting to follow up on why that might have been occurring.
Thanks very much.